Welcome back. Wherever you're listening from tonight, let yourself settle in fully. Let your shoulders drop an inch further into whatever is holding you up. Let your breathing slow, in through the nose, out long and easy, and let the day you've just finished get a little further away with every breath. Tonight, we're walking into a real forest in the south of England, roughly 100 years ago, following a real small boy and his real stuffed animals through 100 acres of heather and pine that would eventually become some of the most beloved fictional woodland in the entire world. Almost everything about the story you already know. The bear, the piglet, the gloomy donkey, the swaying trees actually happened to actual people in an actual place you could still visit today. We're going to walk through it slowly and gently tonight, exactly the unhurried pace a small boy's afternoon in the forest would have actually moved at, pausing at each real detail long enough to properly notice it. You don't need to remember any of it. Let your eyes rest closed. Let your breathing slow further still. There's nothing to solve tonight, only a quiet, real story about a real childhood, considerably more complicated, and in its own way, considerably more tender than the gentle books it eventually became. Let's begin in London, in the summer of 1920, in a house on a quiet Chelsea street. Picture a midwife named Bessie Bashford, who had moved into the Milne household a full month before the birth she'd been engaged to attend, waiting now in an upstairs room at 11 Mallord Street as Daphne Milne, wife of the writer Alan Alexander Milne, went into labor on the 21st of August. The couple had been expecting a girl and had already settled on the name Rosemary. When the baby turned out to be a boy instead, they briefly considered Billy, before deciding it sounded too informal for a child who'd carry the name his whole life. They settled instead on two names, one chosen by each parent, Christopher and Robin. Consider the small, private nickname that actually stuck around the house long before either of his given names did: Billy Moon. A name born from the baby's own early, imperfect attempt to pronounce his own family surname, Milne coming out in an infant's mouth, sounding considerably closer to Moon. It's worth holding onto that detail, since it's the kind of small, private, entirely ordinary family joke that exists in nearly every household. This one simply happening to belong to a family whose more public story would eventually become extraordinary. Picture Christopher's first birthday in the summer of 1921. A teddy bear purchased from Harrods arriving as a present. The kind of ordinary, expected gift countless English children received during this same general period. The bear was given the name Edward, a considered formal little name for what would, within just a few years, become one of the most recognized characters in the entire history of children's literature, though nobody handing over that particular parcel had any reason at all to suspect it yet. Consider, too, a considerably smaller, quieter creature the young family encountered slightly earlier during a holiday at a rented cottage in West Sussex, before Christopher's own family had yet found their more permanent country home. Ponds near the cottage were home to a swan, and the small boy, genuinely delighted by the bird, gave it a name entirely his own invention, Pooh. When the family eventually said their goodbyes and left the cottage behind, young Christopher, according to his father's own later account, decided the swan wouldn't need the name anymore and simply carried it away with him instead, tucked into memory alongside everything else from that particular summer. Picture Alan Milne himself during this same period, a genuinely successful London playwright, novelist, and poet by the time his son was born, but also a man who had served on the Western Front during the First World War, carrying, like a great many men of his generation, real, considerable weight from that experience into his own ordinary civilian life afterward. Milne had first discovered Ashdown Forest in East Sussex during family visits of his own childhood, and something about rediscovering that same quiet, ancient landscape as an adult, considerably removed from London's own busy, demanding rhythm, offered him something genuinely restorative during these difficult post-war years. Consider the year 1925, when Alan Milne finally purchased Cochford Farm, a country house sitting directly on the edge of Ashdown Forest, beside a small babbling brook, close enough to Hartfield Village that the family could reach London easily enough for weekdays, while still returning weekend after weekend to this same considerably quieter corner of Sussex. For the first time in his young son's life, Milne found himself with genuine, sustained time to actually spend with his 5-year-old boy, wandering the surrounding forest together. And it was this same unhurried, considered time, more than any single deliberate creative decision, that would eventually give an entire world its own version of the 100 Acre Wood. Picture the small collection of stuffed animals gradually gathering in Christopher's own nursery across these same years, since Edward Bear was never actually alone for very long. A small stuffed pig joined the collection, considerably plainer and considerably smaller than storybook illustrations, would later make him appear, along with a gray donkey missing some of his original stitching, and purchased together as a genuinely charming pair, a mother kangaroo and her own smaller Joey, each of these ordinary nursery toys, worn soft through genuine daily play rather than careful preservation, would eventually be given names, personalities, and entire imagined lives considerably larger than any single stuffed animal usually gets to have. Consider Ashdown Forest itself, the actual physical landscape these toys would eventually wander through in story after story. A genuinely striking mix of high, open heathland, heather and gorse and bracken, punctuated by hilltop clumps of pine trees and dense pockets of silver birch. A specific, particularly beautiful clearing within the forest, known locally as Gill's Lap, or sometimes Galleon's Lap, became, in the eventual stories, an enchanted place where important, quiet conversations happened, a description that required, according to those who have walked the actual site, remarkably little embellishment at all. Picture the old walnut tree standing in the garden at Cochford Farm itself, its trunk hollowed out with age, in exactly the kind of gap a small boy's imagination could easily transform into a proper house for a bear, or for anyone else who happened to need one. Christopher played inside that same hollow repeatedly during these years, and it would eventually find its way, in slightly altered form, into the treehouse imagery running through several of his father's own stories, one more small, real detail smuggled directly from an actual Sussex garden into what readers everywhere would eventually experience as pure invention. Consider, too, a simple wooden footbridge crossing a small stream near the farm, where father and son together developed an entirely spontaneous game, dropping sticks into the water on one side and racing to the opposite railing to see whose stick emerged first from beneath the bridge. This unplanned, genuinely ordinary piece of childhood play would eventually become one of the most famous games in all of children's literature, and the actual bridge itself, first rebuilt in 1979 to match Shepard's own original illustrations, closely enough that Christopher Robin Milne himself returned in person to reopen it, and rebuilt again 2 decades later after further wear has been kept faithful to the book's own imagery through more than one careful restoration since. Picture now an entirely different story unfolding at almost exactly this same moment, several thousand miles away, and considerably earlier in its own timeline, since the most famous resident of the 100 Acre Wood actually began her own life in Canada. In August of 1914, a Canadian veterinarian named Harry Colebourn, traveling by train to join his regiment at the outbreak of the First World War, stopped briefly at a small station in White River, Ontario, where a trapper offered to sell him an orphaned black bear cub, her mother already killed. Colebourn, a genuine lifelong animal lover, paid $20 for her on the spot. Consider what Colebourn actually did with his new companion over the following months, naming her Winnie after his own adopted hometown of Winnipeg, and bringing her along through military training on England's Salisbury Plain, where she quickly became a genuine, beloved, unofficial mascot to his entire brigade. When his unit finally received orders to deploy to the battlefields of France in December of 1914, Colebourn faced a genuinely difficult decision, since a war zone was obviously no place for a young bear. He arranged instead to leave her, initially meant only as a temporary loan, in the care of the London Zoo. Picture Winnie settling into her new home at the London Zoo, where she remained considerably longer than Colebourn had originally intended, since the war itself dragged on for years and circumstances never quite allowed him to properly reclaim her afterward. Rather than fading into obscurity, Winnie instead became a genuine, considerable celebrity within the zoo itself, remarkably gentle and remarkably tolerant of visitors, known well enough that children were sometimes permitted to actually ride on her back, a level of trust genuinely unusual for a wild animal living in captivity. Consider Harry Colebourn's own continued devotion to the bear he'd left behind, since it's a genuinely tender detail worth including honestly. He returned to Canada after the war, resumed his veterinary practice in Winnipeg, and by every account kept photographs and newspaper clippings about Winnie for the rest of his own life. When he died in 1947, his family discovered letters among his belongings, written but apparently never actually sent, addressed to the London Zoo, quietly asking after Winnie's well-being, years after the bear herself had already died. Picture young Christopher Robin Milne, likely sometime around 1924 or 1925, visiting the London Zoo alongside his father and encountering Winnie directly, an experience genuinely memorable enough that he soon decided his own beloved Edward Bear deserved a considerably more exciting name than the one he'd been given at birth. Combining Winnie's own name with the swan's name he'd carried away from that earlier Sussex holiday, Christopher renamed his teddy bear Winnie the Pooh. And Alan Milne, watching his son's own imaginative naming unfold in real time, recorded the whole small, ordinary moment carefully enough that it eventually made its way directly into the introduction of his own first Pooh book. Consider how directly this entire naming chain actually traces back to real, documented events. A Canadian veterinarian's spontaneous kindness toward an orphaned cub, a swan on a rented pond, and a small boy's own genuine creative instinct for combining two names he loved into something considerably better than either one alone. None of it was invented for the books at all. It had already happened in exactly this order before Alan Milne ever wrote a single word of the stories that would eventually make it famous. Picture the actual writing process unfolding across these same years, beginning with a 1924 poetry collection called When We Were Very Young, which first introduced readers to Christopher Robin and several of his toys in verse form, well before any proper prose stories had been written at all. The considerably more famous Winnie the Pooh followed in 1926, and The House at Pooh Corner arrived 2 years later in 1928, introducing a bouncy new character named Tigger, who joined the nursery's earlier residents somewhat later than the others, once Christopher's own collection of toys had grown to include him. Consider illustrator E.H. Shepard's own considerable contribution to how this entire world eventually looked on the page, since Shepard visited Ashdown Forest directly and sketched its actual landscape with genuine care, meaning many of his now iconic illustrations match real, specific views across the forest almost exactly, allowing, as any careful artist naturally would, for a reasonable degree of gentle creative license here and there. A reader tracing Shepard's own illustrated landscape against the real geography of Ashdown Forest today would recognize an enormous amount of it immediately. Hills and clearings and particular stands of pine trees, rendered with just enough artistic adjustment to feel like genuine storybook magic, while still remaining, underneath it all, a real place that's still there. If you're settling in and your eyes are already closed, that's exactly right. There's no need to hold onto any specific date or detail tonight, just the general, gentle shape of it. A real boy, a real forest, and a real bear, whose own remarkable journey began with one soldier's small act of kindness at a Canadian train station. Picture the book's reception once they actually reached the wider public. Since Winnie the Pooh and its considerably more prose-focused successor became genuine, immediate sensations, translated eventually into dozens of languages, and selling in numbers that would have seemed genuinely unimaginable to anyone in that quiet Sussex farmhouse where the actual stories first took shape. Christopher Robin Milne, still just a young boy throughout this entire period, found himself almost overnight transformed into one of the most recognized children in the entire English-speaking world, his own real name now permanently, inseparably attached to a fictional character readers everywhere assumed they already knew intimately. But what did that sudden, overwhelming fame actually feel like from inside a small boy's own daily life? Consider the genuinely strange experience of attending school as an ordinary child while sharing your exact name with one of literature's most beloved characters. Since Christopher's own classmates, quite reasonably, couldn't always resist teasing him about the association, some of it good-natured, some of it considerably less so. His father, seeking to capitalize further on the book's commercial success, occasionally arranged for young Christopher to make public appearances reciting his father's own poems aloud to audiences who had come specifically to see the real Christopher Robin in person. A genuinely peculiar kind of childhood labor for a boy who hadn't actually chosen any part of his own sudden public role. Picture Christopher's later schooling at Stowe, a considerably more academically demanding environment than his earlier years had prepared him for, where the Christopher Robin Association followed him persistently enough that some classmates reportedly greeted him by singing lines from his father's own published poems whenever he entered a room. It's worth sitting with how genuinely difficult this particular situation actually was. An ordinary teenage boy trying to establish his own individual identity among his peers, while carrying a famous fictional childhood he'd never personally consented to becoming quite this permanently associated with. Consider Christopher's own path into early adulthood, studying at Trinity College, Cambridge, before serving during the Second World War, seeing genuine combat, and receiving a head wound during his own military service. Experiences that had, by every reasonable measure, considerably more bearing on the actual man he was becoming than any children's book character ever properly could. He returned from the war looking, quite understandably, for some way to build a life and identity genuinely separate from the considerable shadow his own childhood had cast, a search that would occupy him seriously for a good portion of his subsequent adult life. Picture 2, something worth acknowledging honestly rather than smoothing over, since it's a real, documented part of this story. Christopher's relationship with his parents grew genuinely strained across these same years, complicated by his father's own increasing physical frailty later in life, and by tensions that had built gradually across decades regarding exactly how his own childhood fame had been managed and monetized. Following his father's death in 1956, Christopher and his mother grew considerably more distant still, and the two remained largely estranged for the better part of 15 years. A genuine, real sadness sitting honestly alongside everything gentler this story has to offer. Consider, though, how this same difficult chapter fits within Christopher's own much longer, much fuller life, since it would be a genuine disservice to his actual story to let this particular stretch define the whole of it. He was, by this same period, already building something entirely his own, a marriage, a considered independent career, and a set of personal values that would eventually carry him toward exactly the kind of peace his own difficult adolescence and complicated family relationships had made feel for a considerable stretch of years. Genuinely uncertain. Picture Christopher in 1948, marrying his own first cousin, Leslie de Ellincourt, a genuine partnership that would go on to anchor the entire remainder of his life. 3 years later, in 1951, the couple made a deliberate, considered decision that would come to define Christopher's own independent adult identity more than almost anything else. Moving to Dartmouth, in Devon, to open a small bookshop together called the Harbour Bookshop, deliberately choosing a profession and a location entirely separate from London's own literary world, and everything it still associated with his father's name. Consider how genuinely complicated this particular choice actually turned out to be in daily practice, since running a bookshop meant regularly meeting customers who recognized his name immediately and wanted, understandably enough, to discuss the Pooh books directly with him. Exactly the kind of conversation Christopher had specifically hoped moving to Devon might help him avoid. Even his own mother reportedly thought the entire venture was a strange choice, given how directly it seemed likely to keep drawing him back toward the very association he was trying to build a life apart from. And yet, Christopher and Leslie ran that same shop together for many years, genuinely successfully, without ever once accepting royalty income from his father's books to help sustain it. Picture the reason behind that particular deliberate choice, since it reveals something genuine about Christopher's own considered values. He didn't begin collecting any royalties from the Pooh books at all until 1971, well over 2 decades into his own adult working life, and only then following his mother's death. Building the bookshop entirely on its own commercial merits, rather than leaning on income connected to his childhood fame, represented a genuinely deliberate, sustained act of independence, proof to himself, if to no one else, that he could build something real and lasting that was entirely, genuinely his own. Consider, too, the considerable personal challenge Christopher and Leslie faced together during these same years, since their only child, a daughter named Claire, was born in 1955 with severe cerebral palsy, requiring extensive lifelong care rather than allowing this genuine hardship to diminish their family's life together. Christopher and Leslie devoted themselves seriously to her care, and Christopher became a genuine, committed advocate for disability support more broadly, channeling exactly the kind of quiet, patient attention that had once gone into a small boy's imaginative forest games into something considerably more serious, and in its own way, every bit as tender. Picture Christopher's own considerable civic engagement across these same later decades, since his life extended well beyond simply running a bookshop and raising a family. He became a genuine, active advocate for improving school libraries, campaigned seriously to protect Ashdown Forest itself, the same real landscape that had once inspired his father's stories, from proposed oil drilling that threatened to permanently damage it and contributed considerable time and energy to the Save the Children Fund. It's worth noticing how directly this later civic life connects back to his own childhood forest, the same place that had once given him such genuine, private joy, eventually becoming something he actively, publicly worked to protect for everyone else. Consider Christopher's decision in 1974 to finally break what he himself described as a lifelong habit of reticence, publishing the first of 3 autobiographical books called The Enchanted Places, offering readers a genuinely honest, considered account of his own childhood, and what he candidly called its difficult aftermath. This wasn't a bitter or resentful book, so far as those who have read it carefully generally describe it, but a genuinely thoughtful, searching attempt to finally speak plainly about a childhood that had, for decades, been narrated almost entirely by other people on his own behalf. Picture the 2 further volumes that followed. The Path Through the Trees in 1979, focusing on his adult life and his own considerable struggle to step fully out from his father's shadow, and The Hollow on the Hill in 1982, continuing these same honest, considered reflections. Writing these books represented, in a very real sense, Christopher finally, deliberately reclaiming authorship over his own life story after spending decades as a character in someone else's, a genuinely meaningful act of self-definition for a man who had spent so much of his early life having his own identity narrated for him by others. Picture, for a moment, the actual fate of the original toys themselves, since it's a genuinely satisfying thread to follow all the way to its own considered ending. Christopher's real childhood companions, Edward Bear turned Winnie the Pooh, the small stuffed pig, the threadbare donkey, and the kangaroo pair, eventually traveled to the United States, where they've been carefully preserved and displayed for decades at the New York Public Library's Central Research Branch, viewed today by millions of visitors from around the entire world. It's worth sitting with that journey for a moment. Ordinary English nursery toys, worn soft through genuine daily play in a Sussex farmhouse, now resting behind protective glass in one of the world's great libraries, considerably further from home than any of them could possibly have imagined during their own quiet, original life in Christopher's own bedroom. Consider illustrator E. H. Shepard's own personal history for a moment. Since his particular skill at rendering Ashdown Forest so faithfully wasn't accidental, Shepard, like Alan Milne himself, had served during the First World War, and the 2 men shared, in their own separate, private ways, a genuine understanding of exactly how much quiet, ordinary beauty could matter after the kind of considerable hardship both had personally witnessed. Shepard would go on to know a far heavier loss of his own years later, when his son Graham, an illustrator in his own right, was killed in action during the Second World War. A grief that fell long after these particular drawings were finished, but one worth holding onto honestly all the same. A reminder that the gentle, careful hand behind the 100 Acre Wood's own illustrations belonged to a man who came to understand loss in more than one form across his own long life. Picture Alan Milne's own genuinely complicated feelings about the considerable success his Pooh books eventually achieved. Since it's worth understanding honestly rather than assuming his own relationship to this success was entirely comfortable. Milne had built a respected career writing plays, essays, and novels for adult readers well before Pooh's arrival. And he grew, across his own later years, genuinely frustrated that this considerably smaller portion of his overall literary output had come to overshadow nearly everything else he'd written. It's a detail worth holding alongside Christopher's own complicated relationship to fame, since father and son, in their own separate ways, each found themselves living somewhat uncomfortably in the shadow of the very same small, beloved bear. Picture the considerable, genuinely global reach these stories eventually achieved, translated into dozens of languages across the following decades, including, in 1958, a full Latin translation titled Winnie Ille Pooh, which went on to become the first foreign language book ever to appear on the New York Times bestseller list. A genuinely remarkable achievement for a story that began as one father's private entertainment for his own small son on quiet weekend afternoons in Sussex. Consider what this actually says about the underlying universal appeal of the story itself. Since a forest, a bear, and a handful of gentle friendships apparently required no specific cultural context at all to move readers across an enormous range of different countries and languages. Picture, too, the Walt Disney Company's own eventual involvement with these characters, acquiring certain adaptation rights beginning in the 1960s and producing a series of animated films and considerable merchandise that introduced Pooh and his friends to an entirely new, considerably larger global audience than the original books alone had ever reached. This commercial expansion happened largely after Alan Milne's own death in 1956, meaning Christopher himself lived through and witnessed this entire second wave of his childhood's transformation into a global media phenomenon. His own name and face increasingly disconnected from the character bearing his name as new generations encountered Pooh primarily through animation rather than through his father's original prose. Consider how this particular development likely affected Christopher's own relationship with his childhood legacy, since it represented, in its own way, a further layer of separation between the actual boy who had once played in a real Sussex forest and the increasingly commercialized, increasingly cartoon-adjacent character, now carrying forward some version of his own childhood name. It's worth understanding this as one more genuine complication layered onto an already complicated inheritance, rather than assuming Christopher's own feelings about his famous namesake ever settled into any single, simple, unchanging attitude across his entire adult life. Picture a genuinely ordinary afternoon in that same nursery, years before any of this considerable fame had even begun. Sunlight coming through tall windows, a small boy arranging his toys carefully along the edge of a low shelf, giving each one, in his own private imagination, a distinct personality that had nothing at all to do with any eventual publication. This is worth holding onto carefully, since it's easy, looking backward from everything the story eventually became, to forget that all of it began as something genuinely small and private, a child's ordinary, unremarkable play, observed closely and lovingly by a father who happened to also be a considerably skilled writer. Consider Daphne Milne's own role in this same family story, since she's often mentioned only briefly in popular retellings, focused primarily on father and son. She was, by most accounts, a genuinely stylish, socially engaged woman, and her own relationship with young Christopher appears to have been, at least during his earliest childhood, warm and attentive, even as the family's later years grew considerably more strained. It's worth resisting the temptation to flatten any single family member into either simple villain or simple saint, since real families, this one included, tend to hold considerably more complexity than any tidy summary can properly capture. Picture the specific writing rhythm Alan Milne actually kept while composing these stories, working often from a garden chair at Cochford Farm itself during the warmer months, or from his own considered desk during quieter weekday stretches back in London, drawing directly and repeatedly from his son's real, ongoing play, rather than inventing entirely new adventures from nothing. This meant the books themselves developed with a genuine, unhurried rhythm of their own, closer to careful observation, lovingly translated onto the page than to any conventional, plotted children's fiction, being written from pure imagination alone. It's worth being honest about something easy to overlook amid all this real, documented detail. Since not every character in these stories actually began as one of Christopher's own physical toys. Owl and Rabbit, both genuinely important figures within the Hundred Acre Wood's own small community, were entirely invented by Milne himself. Characters who existed only in the stories, rather than as physical stuffed animals in Christopher's own real nursery. Consider what this distinction actually tells us about how the books were genuinely constructed. Real toys and real places providing the story's actual foundation, with Milne's own considerable creative imagination filling in whatever additional characters and plot the underlying real material still needed to become a genuinely complete, satisfying story. Picture Eeyore specifically, since the genuinely gloomy donkey remains one of the collection's most beloved characters. His own particular melancholy apparently reflecting, at least according to some who knew the family, a gentle exaggeration of the actual toy's own considerably worn, drooping physical condition by the time young Christopher had loved him thoroughly enough to leave him looking genuinely threadbare. It's a small, tender detail worth sitting with, that a father's careful, affectionate observation of his own son's well-loved, slightly battered toy could transform so directly into one of children's literature's most enduringly sympathetic characters. Consider Piglet's own considerably more anxious personality as well, a trait that seems to have emerged largely from Milne's own creative imagination, rather than from anything specific about the small stuffed pig's physical appearance. Since the real toy itself was, by most accounts, simply an ordinary, unremarkable nursery pig before Milne's own writing gave him his now famous, nervous, easily worried temperament. This same basic pattern repeats throughout the entire collection. Real physical objects and real places providing genuine, grounding inspiration, while Milne's own considerable skill as a writer supplied the actual personalities, voices, and adventures that turned ordinary nursery toys into genuinely beloved literary characters. Picture one of these public recitation appearances in slightly more detail. A young Christopher standing before an audience of adults and children who had paid specifically to see him, reciting his father's own published verses about himself. A genuinely strange kind of performance for any child to be asked to give, essentially playing a public, fictionalized version of his own private self for people who had come specifically expecting to meet a storybook character rather than an ordinary boy. Consider how psychologically disorienting this particular experience must have been, blurring in ways a child couldn't reasonably be expected to properly process. The line between his own genuine identity and the considerably more polished, more marketable version of himself his father's books had already created. Consider, too, how this same basic pattern, a child's private life transformed into public entertainment, has recurred across considerably more recent decades in the specific context of child performers and child celebrities more broadly. A pattern researchers studying childhood development have since identified as carrying genuine, documented psychological risk, particularly regarding a child's own developing sense of authentic identity apart from their public persona. Christopher Robin Milne's own experience, unfolding decades before anyone had developed formal research or vocabulary, specifically addressing this particular challenge, offers a genuinely early, well-documented example of exactly the difficulty later child psychologists would eventually study in more systematic detail. Picture gently how directly this connects back to Christopher's own later deliberate choice to build an adult identity so thoroughly separate from his childhood fame. The bookshop, the marriage, the civic work, the eventual autobiographical books reclaiming his own narrative voice. None of it happened by simple accident. Each step represented a genuinely considered, patient response to exactly the disorientation his own childhood experience had created. A man working steadily and deliberately across decades to become fully, genuinely himself again. But how did Christopher actually go about building that separate, independent identity in practical, everyday terms? Picture the Harbor bookshop itself on an ordinary Dartmouth afternoon. Narrow shelves lined with carefully chosen titles, the particular smell of paper and old binding glue. Christopher himself behind the counter, genuinely knowledgeable and genuinely engaged with the books he sold, considerably more interested, by most accounts, in discussing an obscure novel with an interested customer than in discussing his own famous childhood with a curious visitor who'd wandered in specifically hoping to meet the real Christopher Robin. Leslie worked alongside him for years, the two of them building a genuinely modest but genuinely respected small business. Exactly the kind of quiet, considered life Christopher had spent considerable effort making entirely his own. consider Claire Milne's own life a little more fully, since she deserves genuine attention beyond simply being mentioned as her parents' considerable challenge and responsibility. Born in 1955 with severe cerebral palsy, Claire required extensive care throughout her entire life, and Christopher and Leslie's devoted attention to her needs shaped their family's daily rhythm for decades. After Christopher's own death and eventually Claire's own passing in 2012, a charitable trust was established in her name, the Claire Milne Trust, specifically supporting people living with cerebral palsy. A lasting, practical legacy considerably removed from anything involving bears or forests, but genuinely reflecting the same patient, devoted attention Christopher had brought to caring for her throughout her own life. Picture Christopher's own final years, living with myasthenia gravis, a genuine chronic condition affecting muscle strength that gradually became more pronounced as he aged. He continued living in Devon, in the quiet town of Teotines, remaining active in his own community and in his considered writing for as long as his health genuinely allowed. He died peacefully in his sleep on the 20th of April, 1996, at 75 years old, in the same gentle, unhurried manner that seemed to characterize so much of his own carefully, deliberately constructed later life. Picture Ashdown Forest today, still genuinely open to the public, protected common land, where visitors can walk the same heathland paths, find the same clearing at Gill's Lap, and stand on the same rebuilt wooden bridge where a father and son once raced sticks beneath the railing together. A small shop in the nearby village of Hartfield, called Pooh Corner, has operated for decades, selling honey and storybooks to visitors specifically drawn there by the real landscape's own considerable literary connection. A genuinely thriving small local economy built entirely around one family's quiet, ordinary weekend walks nearly a century ago. Consider what it might actually mean to walk that same forest today, knowing everything tonight's story has covered: the real boy, the real toys, the real complicated adulthood that eventually followed his considerably simpler, more golden childhood. The forest itself hasn't changed nearly as much as everything surrounding it has. The same heather, the same pine clumps, the same quiet stream beneath the same rebuilt bridge, patient and unhurried in exactly the way the actual stories, at their best, always tried to be. Picture, too, Christopher Robin Milne's own considered words about his childhood, offered decades later in his own careful, adult voice, rather than through his father's own earlier interpretation of him, describing the actual places from his own story as genuinely real. A real wood, a real corner of it, and a real bear, who had once been nothing more exotic than an ordinary teddy purchased at Harrod's, and a name borrowed with real affection from an orphaned Canadian cub who'd once charmed an entire London zoo. Picture something genuinely delightful still happening today, decades after that first spontaneous game between a father and his small son, an actual World Poo-Sticks Championship held annually along the Thames at Days Lock in Oxfordshire since 1984, drawing considerable numbers of genuinely enthusiastic competitors dropping sticks from a bridge, railing in exactly the same simple spirit Christopher and his father once did on their own considerably smaller Sussex footbridge. Consider what a genuinely fitting tribute this actually represents. An entirely unplanned piece of ordinary childhood play, becoming, across the better part of a century, first a beloved fictional pastime, and eventually a genuine, organized, internationally recognized competition, all without ever losing the essentially simple, unhurried pleasure that made it worth playing in the first place. Picture the forest across its different seasons, since the actual Ashdown Forest Christopher knew as a boy would have looked genuinely different depending on exactly when he walked through it. Spring brought the heather's own gradual return to green, after winters considerably starker, more open browns. Summer filled the air with the specific, warm scent of gorse in bloom. Autumn turned the silver birches gold before their leaves finally fell, and winter left the whole landscape genuinely stark and quiet. Footprints in fresh snow, the only sign anyone had passed through recently at all. A father and son walking this same forest across an entire childhood would have experienced it, season after season, as an ever-changing, endlessly interesting place, considerably richer than any single description could properly capture. Consider, too, the particular quality of light across Ashdown Forest specifically. Its elevated, open heathland catching considerably more direct sky than the denser, more enclosed woodland found elsewhere across the surrounding Sussex countryside, meaning the forest itself would have felt genuinely bright and expansive during clear weather, and genuinely atmospheric, mist settling low across the heather during the region's own frequent overcast mornings. It's worth picturing both moods clearly. since the real 100-acre wood was never simply one single, fixed kind of place, but a genuinely living landscape, changing constantly with weather and season and time of day, exactly the way any real forest actually does. Picture E. H. Shepard's own working process a little more closely, since his illustrations weren't purely imaginative either. Christopher's actual toys were brought directly to Shepard for careful, direct reference, meaning the bear, the pig, and the donkey appearing throughout the published books were sketched, at least initially, from the genuine physical objects themselves, their particular proportions, their particular worn textures, translated as faithfully as pen and ink could manage onto the printed page. It's one more small, considerable layer of real physical accuracy sitting quietly underneath a story so many readers have always assumed was pure invention from beginning to end. Consider the actual publication and early marketing of these books. Since Winnie the Pooh arrived in October of 1926 to genuinely immediate, considerable commercial success, its warm reception establishing, almost overnight, an expectation that further stories featuring the same characters would naturally follow. This immediate success meant the pressure on Alan Milne to continue mining his own son's ongoing childhood for fresh material began building almost as soon as the first book reached shelves. A genuine, practical publishing reality that likely shaped, in ways worth acknowledging honestly, exactly how much of Christopher's own subsequent childhood ended up filtered through his father's considerable literary lens. Picture, briefly, how this same basic tension, a parent's creative work drawing directly and considerably on a child's own private life, has recurred across other literary families in considerably different eras since, each case carrying its own particular version of the same underlying question: where exactly does a parent's genuine creative inspiration end, and a child's own right to a private, unexamined childhood properly begin? Christopher Robin Milne's own story remains, among these various cases, one of the most thoroughly documented, precisely because he eventually found his own considered adult voice to describe exactly how it actually felt from his own side of that particular, genuinely difficult equation. Picture the London Zoo itself during this same general period, a genuinely popular destination for London families, considerably more modest in scale than its modern counterpart, but already home to a genuinely wide range of animals, elephants and big cats, and considerable numbers of birds, drawing regular crowds of exactly the kind of curious children who would have found Winnie's own particular gentleness and tolerance for visitors genuinely remarkable among the zoo's more typically distant, more cautious residents. Consider what it must have actually felt like for a small boy, already fond of his own stuffed bear at home, to encounter a real, living bear willing to be touched and approached with this kind of genuine trust. A considerably more vivid, more immediate experience than any storybook illustration could ever quite manage to replicate. Picture Harry Colebourn's own regiment, the Fort Garry Horse, a genuine Canadian cavalry unit that trained on England's Salisbury Plain before deploying to France. Winnie herself becoming enough of a beloved fixture during those training months that soldiers reportedly competed for the genuine privilege of looking after her daily needs. Consider what this small detail actually tells us about the considerable comfort an ordinary animal could offer soldiers facing an uncertain, genuinely frightening deployment ahead of them. A young bear cub's simple, uncomplicated presence, providing exactly the kind of gentle normalcy that men bound for the Western Front's own considerable horrors likely needed and appreciated more than most surviving records ever fully capture. Consider, too, how directly this same basic comfort, an animal's simple presence, easing genuine human difficulty, echoes forward into the eventual books themselves, since Christopher's own toys served a remarkably similar function for him decades later, offering steady, uncomplicated companionship through what would eventually become his own considerably complicated childhood. A bear's simple presence, whether real and living in a wartime training camp or stuffed and waiting patiently on a nursery shelf, seems to have offered genuine comfort in both cases, entirely regardless of the very different circumstances surrounding each one. Picture the genuinely poignant final chapter of The House at Pooh Corner, published in 1928, in which Christopher Robin, within the story itself, prepares to leave the 100 Acre Wood behind for school, a fictional farewell that mirrored, with almost uncomfortable directness, the real Christopher's own approaching departure from home for his own, considerably more formal education. Milne seems to have understood, even as he wrote it, that this particular book would likely be his last extended visit to this same imaginative world, since an older, school-bound Christopher would soon have considerably less patience and considerably less available time for the kind of unhurried, imaginative forest play that had originally inspired the entire series. Consider how genuinely bittersweet this timing actually turned out to be. An author capturing his own son's childhood at almost exactly the precise moment it was beginning to end, preserving forever, in careful, considered prose, a version of Christopher that the real boy himself was already, quite naturally, starting to grow beyond. It's worth sitting with the genuine tenderness in that timing. A father recognizing with real clarity that this particular chapter of his own son's life deserved to be properly, carefully remembered before it closed for good. Picture, too, how this same bittersweet quality has continued resonating with readers across every subsequent generation since. Adults returning to these same stories decades after their own childhoods, recognizing in that final chapter's gentle, unhurried farewell something genuinely true about growing up more broadly. That every childhood, however golden, eventually gives way to something else, and that the kindest way to mark that transition isn't to resist it, but simply to notice it clearly, and to hold what came before with real, considered tenderness. Let your shoulders settle a little further now, wherever you're resting tonight, since we're moving gently from Christopher's own remarkable childhood toward the considerably longer, considerably quieter adult life that eventually followed it. It's worth remembering as we continue that the difficult chapters we've walked through honestly tonight, the estrangement, the discomfort with fame, the genuine complexity of growing up as someone else's beloved character, were never the whole of his story. They were simply one real, considered part of it, sitting alongside everything gentler and warmer. This same story also genuinely contains. Picture Christopher's own considered reflections on fame itself, offered across his 3 autobiographical books, generally avoiding outright bitterness in favor of something considerably more nuanced, a genuine, adult attempt to understand exactly how a childhood this unusual had actually shaped him, without either fully rejecting it or fully embracing the version of himself the wider world had already decided to love. Readers of his own adult writing generally describe him as remarkably clear-eyed and fair, willing to acknowledge real, genuine gratitude for the parts of his childhood that had been genuinely happy, while remaining equally honest about the parts that had genuinely, considerably complicated his own adult sense of self. Consider how rare this particular kind of balanced, considered self-reflection actually is, especially for someone whose entire adult life had been shaped by a single, overwhelming childhood experience he'd never personally chosen. Christopher could have easily settled into simple resentment or into simple, uncomplicated nostalgia, either one considerably easier positions to maintain than the genuinely difficult, honest middle ground he actually occupied instead, holding both real gratitude and real complication together simultaneously across the entire remainder of his own carefully considered life. Picture Ashdown Forest's own considerably older history, since the landscape Christopher explored as a boy carried centuries of accumulated human use well before the Milne family ever arrived there. The forest had served as a royal hunting ground since medieval times, its open heathland deliberately maintained through careful grazing and periodic controlled burning, specifically to keep it suitable for deer. A managed landscape rather than untouched wilderness, shaped by human hands for the better part of 1,000 years before Christopher Robin ever wandered through it with his own small collection of toys. Consider how fitting this actually is, that the real 100 Acre Wood was never simply raw, untouched nature, but a landscape genuinely shaped by generations of careful, deliberate human attention. Not unlike the careful, deliberate attention Alan Milne himself brought to shaping his son's ordinary play into something considerably more enduring. Picture, too, the broader literary and academic attention these books have received across the decades since their original publication, studied seriously by scholars examining everything from their considerable psychological insight into childhood imagination to their genuinely careful, precise prose style. Praised repeatedly by critics for achieving something considerably harder than it first appears. Writing that speaks with real, unaffected simplicity to young children, while still offering adult readers genuine emotional depth and considerable literary craft underneath that same simplicity. A. Milne, whatever his own personal frustration at being overshadowed by this particular work, produced something scholars still consider a genuinely significant achievement in children's literature, regardless of how uncomfortably its real-world cost eventually settled onto the actual child who inspired it. Picture a small memorial stone standing today at Gill's Lap itself, that same enchanted place with an Ashdown Forest, placed there specifically to honor both Alan Milne and E.H. Shepard. Quiet, permanent recognition of exactly how much this particular landscape actually mattered to the story it eventually helped create. Visitors walking the forest today can find it easily enough. A modest, unassuming marker in a genuinely beautiful clearing, considerably less grand than the story's own worldwide fame might otherwise suggest, but fitting in its own understated way for a story that always found its truest, most affecting moments in exactly this kind of quiet, unassuming ordinariness. Consider how directly this same quiet, understated quality actually runs through nearly everything we've covered together tonight. A modest stone in a real forest clearing, an ordinary teddy bear bought at Harrods, a swan on a rented pond, a Canadian soldier's $20 impulse purchase at a small train station. None of the genuine, real events behind this entire beloved story were ever especially dramatic on their own. They became remarkable only in retrospect, once a father's careful attention and considerable literary skill had gathered them together into something the whole world eventually came to love. Picture, gently, how many separate, ordinary lives actually converged to make this one story possible. A midwife arriving a month early to await a birth. A Canadian veterinarian who couldn't resist an orphaned cub. A swan who never knew it had lent its name to literary history. An illustrator who'd lost his own son to war and brought real, careful tenderness to drawing another man's living one instead. Each of these separate, ordinary people contributed some small, essential piece, without any single one of them fully understanding, at the time, exactly what they were actually building together. Picture Leslie Milne, Christopher's own wife and first cousin, whose steady, considerable partnership across nearly 5 decades of marriage provided exactly the kind of stable, genuinely chosen family life Christopher had likely needed most, following a childhood in which so much of his own family experience had been shaped by forces considerably beyond his own control. Consider how meaningful it likely was for Christopher to build, quite deliberately, a marriage and a family life based entirely on his own choices, a partner he'd chosen, a shop they'd built together, a daughter they'd devoted themselves to caring for. None of it narrated or managed by anyone else on his behalf. Picture those who knew Christopher personally during his final years in Devon, describing him, by most considered accounts, as a genuinely settled, contented man, someone who had, after decades of careful, patient work, finally arrived at real comfort with the whole complicated shape of his own remarkable life. One acquaintance who knew him during this same period wrote, in terms worth holding onto gently tonight, that Christopher had been, in a very real sense, quite happy with who he was, both at the very beginning of his life and, more importantly, at its considered end. Consider how genuinely meaningful that specific observation actually is, given everything we've walked through together tonight. A childhood that began in genuine joy, grew considerably complicated through fame he'd never chosen, and eventually, through decades of patient, deliberate effort, found its way back towards something close to that same original contentment, changed and matured by everything in between, but genuinely, authentically at peace by the time it actually mattered most. Why has this particular story, out of so many children's books written during this same general period, managed to hold onto such genuine, enduring affection across an entire century since? Consider what actually sits underneath its considerable, lasting appeal, since it's worth understanding honestly, rather than simply accepting the story's own popularity as somehow self-evident. Unlike many children's stories built around dramatic adventure or clear moral lessons, the Pooh books instead offer something considerably quieter: genuine warmth, patient friendship, and a fundamentally gentle, unhurried way of moving through the world. Qualities that apparently continue resonating with readers regardless of which particular decade or culture happens to be encountering them for the first time. Picture a specific scene from the actual books mapped directly onto its real location. Pooh and Piglet setting out to trap a heffalump somewhere within the forest's own genuine terrain, or Eeyore's own gloomy, thistle-eating corner tucked into some real, specific patch of Ashdown Forest's actual landscape. Readers who have walked the real forest with these stories in mind often describe a genuinely striking sensation, recognizing specific bends in the path, specific clusters of trees, specific quality of light that match, almost exactly, illustrations they'd first encountered as children decades earlier. Fiction and physical reality overlapping in a way genuinely few other beloved children's books ever quite manage to offer their own readers. Consider, too, how this same real, walkable geography likely contributes directly to the story's own particular, lasting emotional power, since readers aren't simply imagining an entirely invented fantasy world when they picture the 100-acre wood. They are imagining, whether they consciously realize it or not, an actual place that genuinely exists, that a real father and real son genuinely walked together, that remains, even now, genuinely available to be visited by anyone curious enough to make the journey themselves. Picture the considerable modern research interest this same story continues attracting even today. Historians and archivists at institutions, including the University of Winnipeg and the New York Public Library, continuing to catalog and study surviving letters, photographs, and original documents connected to both halves of this real story. Winnie's own wartime journey and Christopher's own childhood correspondence. A great-granddaughter of Harry Colebourn's, working from his own preserved wartime diaries decades later, eventually published a children's book of her own, retelling the real bear story. A genuinely fitting continuation of exactly the same impulse that first drove her great-grandfather to rescue an orphaned cub at a small Ontario train station. Consider how many separate families, across more than a century now, have found themselves genuinely connected through this one small, real story. The Milnes in Sussex, the Colebourns in Winnipeg, each carrying forward their own piece of a shared history. Neither family could have possibly anticipated when their own respective ancestors first crossed paths with a bear cub or a curious small boy. It's a genuinely lovely thing to sit with tonight. How far a single act of kindness, a soldier buying an orphaned cub rather than leaving her behind, can eventually travel, reaching forward across generations and continents in ways nobody involved could have ever properly predicted. Picture the considerable contrast between the Milne family's two separate homes during Christopher's own childhood. The townhouse on Mallard Street in Chelsea, busy and considerably more formal, surrounded by London's own constant activity, and Cochford Farm itself, considerably quieter, considerably more relaxed, where the family's weekend and holiday rhythms genuinely slowed down enough for real, unhurried time together. Consider how directly this contrast likely shaped Christopher's own deepest, most treasured childhood memories, since nearly everything genuinely warm and gentle in his own later recollections traces back specifically to Sussex, rather than to the family's considerably busier London life. Picture the specific rooms within Cochford Farm itself, Christopher's own bedroom, still preserved today according to those who have visited the property, since low ceilings and considerable natural light. A genuinely modest, comfortable country farmhouse rather than anything grand or imposing. The house itself dates back considerably further than the Milne family's own ownership. An old farmhouse with genuine historical roots of its own. Simply one more real, physical detail underlying a story so many readers have always assumed existed only within the pages of a book. Consider, too, the particular rhythm an ordinary weekend at Cochford Farm would have actually followed, arriving from London on a Friday evening, considerable unpacking and settling in. A full Saturday spent largely outdoors, walking, playing, exploring whatever specific corner of the forest happened to catch a small boy's own particular attention that day, and a slower Sunday before the family's eventual, considerably more reluctant return to London for another working week. This same basic rhythm, repeated across many years, many seasons, many ordinary weekends, is really what actually produced the 100 Acre Wood. Not any single dramatic moment of inspiration, but simply patient, repeated, genuinely loving attention, paid consistently across considerable time. Picture biographer Anne Thwaite, whose considerably thorough 1990 biography of Alan Milne remains one of the most carefully researched accounts of this entire family's real story, drawing on personal letters, interviews, and archival material to piece together a considered, honest picture of exactly how the Pooh books actually came to be written, and exactly what their creation genuinely cost the real family behind them. Thwaite's own careful, patient research represents exactly the kind of considered scholarly work that allows a story like this one, so easily flattened into simple, sentimental legend, to instead be told with real, honest complexity intact. Consider how much of tonight's own careful account actually depends on exactly this kind of patient, biographical, and archival work. Historians and researchers spending years combing through personal correspondence, publishers' records, and family recollections, specifically so that a story this beloved could eventually be told honestly, rather than simply repeating whichever comfortable, simplified version had already settled into popular imagination. It's worth appreciating gently how much careful effort actually sits behind even the gentlest, most sensory details we've covered together tonight. Real research, patiently assembled, standing quietly behind every single scene. Picture a second poetry collection. Now we are 6, published in 1927, arriving between the two prose Pooh books and continuing the same gentle, verse-driven exploration of Christopher's own ongoing childhood, its title marking with genuine specificity exactly how old the real boy actually was at the time of its writing. These poems captured small, genuinely ordinary domestic moments, considerable affection for his own golden hair, his particular childhood habits, and small daily routines, each poem a kind of careful, loving snapshot of exactly who Christopher actually was during this specific, narrow window of his own early life. Consider how directly these poems, alongside Shepard's own careful illustrations, actually preserved physical details about the real Christopher that might otherwise have simply faded from family memory, the way most ordinary childhood details eventually do. His particular hair color, his particular way of standing or walking, small physical mannerisms captured specifically because his father happened to be writing about them at exactly that moment, meaning an unusually large amount of ordinary physical detail about one specific real child's early years survives today, considerably more than most families, even genuinely loving ones, ever manage to preserve about their own children's earliest years. Picture, finally, what it must have actually felt like for Christopher himself, considerably later in life, to encounter these same poems again as an adult, reading his own father's careful, loving descriptions of a small boy who was, in a very real sense, both entirely himself and also, by that point, someone considerably different from the man he'd actually grown into. It's worth holding that particular strangeness gently tonight, the genuine oddity of having your own earliest childhood permanently preserved in loving detail by someone else's careful pen, available for the whole world to read and love, long after you yourself had grown into someone considerably more complicated than any poem could properly capture. Picture child development researchers working considerably later than any of tonight's actual events, studying exactly why imaginative play with familiar objects, stuffed animals especially, matters so genuinely much to a child's own healthy emotional development. Researchers generally understand this kind of play as helping children safely process real emotions and real social situations through a comfortable, low-stakes imaginative filter, exactly the kind of quiet, unhurried processing Christopher himself was almost certainly doing, without any conscious awareness of it, every single afternoon he spent narrating adventures for Edward Bear and his other nursery companions. Consider, too, a genuinely unexpected later chapter in these books' own considerable cultural life. When American author Benjamin Hoff published The Tao of Pooh in 1982, drawing careful, genuinely thoughtful parallels between Pooh's own simple, uncomplicated approach to the world and considerable principles from ancient Chinese Taoist philosophy. The book itself became a genuine bestseller, introducing an entirely new generation of adult readers to these same beloved characters through an entirely unexpected philosophical lens. Proof that a story, originally written for one specific small boy in one specific Sussex farmhouse, could still, more than half a century later, find genuinely new and unexpected ways to matter to readers who'd never have otherwise picked up a children's book at all. Picture how this same basic pattern, an ordinary children's story revealing genuine, unexpected depth under careful adult attention, connects back to everything else tonight's account has tried to demonstrate: that the real story behind these beloved books was never actually simple or purely sentimental at all, but genuinely rich enough, genuinely complicated enough to reward exactly this kind of careful, patient, honest attention from philosophers and biographers, and tonight from you. Picture the considerable, ongoing scholarly interest, specifically in Christopher's own status as an only child, since this particular family structure shaped his childhood experience in ways worth understanding honestly. Without siblings to share attention or to share the eventual burden of his father's considerable fame, Christopher carried the entire weight of being the Christopher Robin essentially alone, with no brother or sister who might have understood from genuinely similar direct experience exactly what that particular burden actually felt like from the inside. Consider how this same isolation likely made his own toys and his own eventual imaginative forest world considerably more important to him than they might otherwise have been for a child with siblings to share his daily play. How much time actually passed between Christopher's real childhood and its transformation into published material. Picture the actual timeline separating these real childhood events from their eventual publication, since it wasn't especially long at all. Christopher was born in 1920, received Edward Bear in 1921, and by 1924, when we were very young first reached readers, he was still just a small boy of 3 or 4. His own actual childhood and its increasingly famous literary version, now unfolding almost simultaneously, rather than one following comfortably after the other with any real separation between them. This compressed timeline meant Christopher never really had the chance to simply live an ordinary early childhood and process it privately afterward, the way most people eventually do. His childhood and its public version were, from a genuinely early age, essentially the same continuous, overlapping experience. Consider how directly this particular timing detail explains so much of the genuine difficulty Christopher would go on to describe in his own later considered writing. Since there was simply no private, unpublished version of his own early childhood left for him to privately return to and process later on his own terms, the way most adults eventually get to do with their own earliest years. His childhood belonged to the public almost from its very beginning, a genuinely unusual burden for any small boy to carry. However loving and well-intentioned his own father's original motivations had genuinely been. Picture the actual publishing arrangements behind these books. Matthew and Handling Publication in Britain, and E. P. Dutton bringing the stories to American readers, both companies recognizing almost immediately the considerable commercial potential in what had originally begun as private family material. Alan Milne, navigating these business relationships on his family's behalf, eventually sold certain merchandising rights that would go on to generate considerable revenue for decades afterward. Decisions made years before Christopher himself was old enough to have any say in how his own childhood would eventually be commercially licensed and marketed to the wider world. Consider how this same commercial legacy eventually grew into something considerably more complicated across the following decades. The rights to these characters passing through several different hands, sparking, by the 1990s, genuine legal disputes between the various parties holding different pieces of the accumulated licensing and royalty arrangements. Christopher himself, having deliberately avoided collecting royalties for so much of his own adult life, remained largely apart from these later commercial and legal complications. One more small piece of evidence supporting how genuinely, deliberately, he'd managed to separate his own daily life from the considerable business machinery that had grown up around his father's original, simple stories. Picture, briefly, how strange it must have felt for Christopher to watch this same commercial machinery continue expanding throughout his own adult lifetime, entirely disconnected from anything resembling his own actual remembered childhood. Licensing agreements and legal disputes unfolding in boardrooms and courtrooms, an ocean away from the quiet Sussex forest where the whole story had actually, genuinely begun. Picture that earlier holiday cottage in West Sussex a little more fully, since we moved through it rather quickly at the very beginning of tonight's story. Decoy Cottage sat near a scattering of quiet ponds, and the swan Christopher grew so fond of during that particular stay would have been a genuinely common sight across the English countryside during this period. Swans considered a fairly ordinary, if still genuinely elegant, feature of countless ponds and slow rivers throughout Sussex and the surrounding counties. What made this particular swan memorable wasn't anything unusual about the bird itself, but simply a small boy's own attention, freely given, transforming an entirely ordinary countryside encounter into something worth carrying home and remembering. Consider Tigger's own later addition to Christopher's toy collection, arriving considerably after the other animals, purchased specifically, according to most accounts, because Alan Milne recognized his stories needed a livelier, more energetic character to balance the collection's otherwise considerably calmer, more contemplative personalities. Tigger's genuine bounce and enthusiasm, so different from Eeyore's gentle gloom or Piglet's careful anxiety, gave the eventual house at Pooh Corner a genuinely welcome burst of fresh energy. Proof that even a story built almost entirely from careful, patient observation of real childhood play still benefited from a father's own considered, deliberate creative instincts about exactly what the story genuinely needed next. Picture the specific scene introducing Tigger within the actual book, bouncing enthusiastically into the 100 Acre Wood's already established community, genuinely delighting some of the other characters while genuinely unsettling others. Exactly the kind of small, believable social dynamic that made this entire fictional community feel so consistently, warmly real to generations of readers. It's worth noticing how carefully even this later edition still followed the same basic pattern established from the very beginning: real childhood object, real observed personality, gently shaped by a father's own careful literary craft into something considerably larger than any single toy could manage entirely on its own. Picture the considerable volume of fan mail that began arriving at the Milne household once these books reached their wide readership. Letters addressed directly to Christopher Robin himself, often written by children who genuinely believed they were writing to a storybook character rather than to an actual, real boy living an ordinary life in Sussex and London. Consider what it must have felt like for young Christopher to receive these same letters, evidence delivered directly to his own doorstep of exactly how thoroughly the wider world had already claimed a version of him that wasn't entirely, or even primarily, the actual child receiving the mail. Picture Alan Milne's own wartime service a little more fully, since it shaped him considerably before Christopher was ever born. Milne served during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, one of the war's genuinely most devastating engagements before later being assigned to intelligence and propaganda writing work for the remainder of the conflict. A genuine shift from direct combat that likely spared him some of the war's very worst experiences, while still leaving him, like so many veterans of his generation, carrying real, considerable psychological weight from what he had already witnessed. Consider how directly this same wartime experience likely shaped Milne's own eventual deliberate choice to write something as gentle and unhurried as the Pooh stories, a genuine creative retreat into exactly the kind of safe, uncomplicated, deeply peaceful world his own generation's recent, considerable trauma had made feel especially precious. The 100 Acre Wood, in this light, becomes something considerably more meaningful than simple children's entertainment. A father's own genuine, careful attempt to build on paper a version of safety and gentleness the real world he'd personally witnessed had shown him could disappear without warning in an instant. Picture a considerably more recent scene now, an ordinary bedroom somewhere. A parent reading these same stories aloud to their own small child, the exact same gentle, unhurried rhythm Alan Milne first developed nearly a century ago, still doing precisely the same quiet work it always did, helping a small mind settle gradually towards sleep through familiar, comforting repetition and genuinely low stakes, gentle adventure. Consider how many separate generations of children have now fallen asleep to some version of these same stories, the actual details changing slightly with each new edition or adaptation, but the underlying rhythm, patient, warm, entirely unhurried, remaining remarkably consistent across all of it. Picture, too, how fitting it actually is that a story originally created specifically to entertain one small boy during quiet, unhurried Sussex afternoons has gone on to become, for so many subsequent families, exactly this same kind of gentle bedtime ritual, passed down now across considerably more than 4 generations, since Christopher himself first named his own bear after a real Canadian cub he'd met at the London Zoo. The story's original purpose, offering a child comfort, warmth, and gentle imaginative company, has genuinely never changed, even as everything surrounding it, the fame, the merchandising, the legal disputes, the animated adaptations, has grown considerably larger and considerably more complicated than anyone in that original Sussex farmhouse could have possibly imagined. Picture Christopher's relationship with his father, specifically during Alan Milne's own final years, since it's worth drawing a genuine, honest distinction here that's easy to lose amid the broader difficulty of this family's story. While Christopher's relationship with his mother grew considerably more distant and remained largely unresolved, his connection with his father, though genuinely strained by these same years of accumulated tension, never fully broke in quite the same permanent way. Christopher did visit his father during Alan Milne's own final illness, a genuine, if imperfect, thread of connection maintained even through real difficulty, considerably different from the more complete separation that would eventually characterize his relationship with his mother. Consider what this particular distinction actually tells us, since it's worth resisting the temptation to flatten this family's real complexity into a single, simple story of complete estrangement. Christopher's relationships with each of his parents followed genuinely different paths, shaped by different specific tensions and different individual personalities. Exactly the kind of nuanced, imperfect reality most real families actually contain, considerably messier and considerably more human than any tidy single narrative could properly capture. Picture why Christopher actually chose bookselling specifically, among all the possible careers genuinely available to him, since it wasn't simply a random or convenient choice. He had always been, by every account, a genuine, considerable reader in his own right, someone whose actual love of books existed entirely apart from his own complicated relationship with his father's particular writing career. Bookselling let him remain close to something he genuinely loved, literature itself, while building an identity considerably more modest and considerably more personally chosen than continuing any kind of writing career that might have inevitably invited constant comparison to his own father's considerable literary reputation. Consider the Harbor Bookshop's own genuine role within the Dartmouth community across the decades. Christopher and Leslie ran it together, becoming, by most local accounts, a genuinely valued local institution, the kind of small, considered business a community comes to rely on not just for its actual merchandise, but for the particular character and knowledge of the people running it. Christopher's own genuine expertise and genuine enthusiasm for literature, considerably separate from his own famous name, earned him real, independent respect among Dartmouth's own local residents. Exactly the kind of ordinary, earned local reputation he'd likely never have managed to build had he simply continued trading on his childhood fame instead. Picture, finally, how satisfying it must have felt across those many considered years running the shop to be known locally, gradually, as simply Christopher, a knowledgeable, genuinely likable bookseller, rather than primarily as the real Christopher Robin, a small, hard-won, but genuinely meaningful victory, built one ordinary bookshop transaction at a time. Picture, for a moment, how differently Christopher's own life might have unfolded had his father simply never written these particular books at all, using his son's actual toys and actual play purely as private family entertainment rather than eventual published material. Christopher would very likely have grown up as simply an ordinary, unremarkable English boy, his own genuine childhood remaining entirely private, his own adult life free of the particular burden and particular opportunity his father's considerable creative decision eventually created for him. It's a genuinely useful thought experiment, since it clarifies exactly what was actually gained and exactly what was actually lost through his father's own choice to share this private family material with the wider world. Consider what was genuinely gained beyond the obvious financial security the book's commercial success eventually provided. An entire world of readers finding real comfort and real joy in stories built from Christopher's own actual childhood. A considerable, lasting contribution to children's literature that has genuinely brought comfort to millions of children across an entire century since. And consider, too, what was genuinely lost: an ordinary, private childhood, the simple freedom to grow up without an entire world already believing they knew exactly who you were before you'd had any chance to properly decide that for yourself. Picture Christopher himself in his own considered adult writing, generally declining to fully resolve this same difficult balance, one way or the other, acknowledging real gratitude for the genuine joy his father's stories had brought so many readers, while remaining equally honest about the real, personal cost that same joy had required from him directly. It's worth sitting with his own refusal to offer any simple, tidy verdict here, since that same careful, honest ambivalence is likely considerably closer to the actual truth than either a purely celebratory or purely resentful account could ever manage to be. Picture the bronze statue standing today at London Zoo, Harry Colebourn and Winnie captured together in permanent metal, the soldier's hand resting gently near the bear's own raised paw, sculpted by Canadian artist William Epp, and formally donated to the zoo by the Canadian province of Manitoba in 1995. An identical companion statue stands in Winnipeg's own Assiniboine Park Zoo, meaning Colebourn and his beloved bear are memorialized today in permanent bronze on two separate continents, considerably further apart than either of them ever actually traveled together during Winnie's own real, documented lifetime. Consider what it means that both statues emphasize the same basic image: a soldier and a bear, gentle and companionable together, rather than any more dramatic or heroic pose. It's a genuinely fitting choice, since nothing about the real story ever actually required drama or heroism to be worth remembering. A soldier's simple, spontaneous kindness toward an orphaned animal, and a small boy's genuine, uncomplicated love for his own stuffed companion were always the entire, sufficient heart of this whole remarkable story, long before any statue or any book ever tried to properly capture it. Picture, one more time, Harry Colebourn's own preserved wartime diary entries, brief, practical, almost entirely unsentimental on the page, recording simply that he had bought a bear for $20 on a particular August day, and that he had left her at the London Zoo on a particular December day months later. It's worth noticing how little the diary itself actually says about what these two entries would eventually mean, since Colebourn, writing them in the genuine, practical moment, had absolutely no way of knowing he was quietly recording the real, documented beginning of one of the most beloved characters in the entire history of children's literature. Did this particular story genuinely translate, in every sense of that word, once it began traveling well beyond its original English readership? Picture the considerable range of languages these stories eventually reached French readers encountering Winnie Ellerson, German readers meeting Pooh der Bear, Japanese readers welcoming their own careful translation, each version requiring translators to make genuinely thoughtful decisions about exactly how to preserve the original English texts, particular gentle humor and wordplay across languages with genuinely different rhythms and idioms. Consider how much careful, considered craft actually went into each of these translations. Professional translators working to ensure that Pooh's own particular voice, warm, slightly muddled, genuinely endearing, survived the journey into an entirely different language without losing whatever specific quality had made him so beloved in his original English form. Picture Ashdown Forest's own modern conservation status, protected today as common land, managed by a dedicated conservators board, specifically tasked with balancing genuine public access against the forest's own ecological preservation, ensuring the same heathland habitat Christopher once wandered continues supporting its own considerable native wildlife, ground nesting birds, and rare heathland plants among them, for generations of visitors still to come. Consider how fitting this same careful, deliberate conservation work actually is, an entire organization now devoted to protecting the real physical landscape behind a story that has already spent a century teaching readers everywhere the genuine value of patient, gentle attention to the natural world. Consider, too, Cochford Farm's own considerably more private modern status, remaining today a privately owned residence rather than any kind of public museum, meaning visitors hoping to see Christopher's own preserved childhood bedroom or the old hollow walnut tree must generally content themselves with viewing the property from a respectful, appropriate distance. The family who once called this place home having long since moved on, the house itself passing through several subsequent private owners across the decades since. Picture, for a moment, the genuine philosophical question sitting quietly underneath this entire evening's careful account. Exactly who actually owns a childhood once it's been shared this thoroughly with the wider world? Alan Milne, in one very real sense, owned the copyright, the royalties, the considerable creative decisions about exactly how his son's private play would eventually be transformed into published material. Christopher, in an equally real, but considerably less legally enforceable sense, owned the actual, lived experience itself, the genuine memories, the genuine feelings, the genuine cost and genuine joy of having grown up as the real boy behind an entire world's beloved fictional character. Consider how this same basic tension, who owns a shared story, the person who lived it or the person who told it, appears again and again across countless other families, other memoirs, other adaptations of real, lived experience into public creative work. Christopher Robin Milne's own story remains genuinely valuable specifically because he eventually found his own voice within that tension, neither fully rejecting his father's version of events, nor simply accepting it as the complete, final word on his own actual childhood, but adding his own honest, considered account alongside it, letting both versions exist together in their own genuine, sometimes uncomfortable complexity. Picture, finally, what it might mean for any of us listening tonight to hold our own childhoods with this same kind of gentle, honest complexity, neither purely golden nor purely difficult, but genuinely, honestly both, shaped by people who loved us imperfectly, in a world considerably more complicated than any single story, however beloved, could ever fully capture. Picture Alice Liddell, a real Victorian child who inspired an entirely different, equally beloved piece of children's literature, roughly 60 years before Christopher's own childhood. The actual girl behind Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. Consider how genuinely similar their two situations actually turned out to be, decades apart. An ordinary real child transformed into a permanent literary character before she'd had any say in the matter, growing into an adult who spent considerable portions of her own later life navigating a public identity she'd never personally chosen. Alice herself eventually married, raised her own children, and lived what most accounts describe as a genuinely full, considered adult life, offering, in its own way, a useful earlier example of exactly the kind of patient, deliberate identity building Christopher himself would later undertake in his own, considerably different circumstances. Picture what these two real children's parallel experiences actually suggest together about this particular, genuinely unusual category of childhood being permanently attached to a beloved fictional character before you've grown old enough to understand what that attachment will eventually mean for the rest of your own adult life. Both Alice and Christopher found their own considered ways through it. Eventually, each building a genuine adult identity that existed alongside, rather than being fully erased by. The famous fictional child readers everywhere still associate with their real name. Consider how comforting it might be, in its own quiet way, to know that Christopher wasn't actually alone in navigating this particular, genuinely unusual challenge, that other real people in other eras faced broadly similar versions of the same basic difficulty and found, through their own patient efforts, their own way toward a genuine, considered adult life worth living entirely on their own terms. Picture Christopher's own path through Cambridge, winning a mathematics scholarship to Trinity College in 1939, before the outbreak of war interrupted his studies entirely. After the war, he returned and completed his degree, though in English literature rather than mathematics, a genuinely notable shift worth sitting with. Consider what that particular change might suggest. A young man who had left for war, still connected to a subject with real ties to precision and technical discipline, and returned from it, drawn instead toward literature. Perhaps a genuine reflection of everything he'd lived through in the intervening years, or perhaps simply an ordinary young man's evolving interests, changed by considerable real experience, the way most people's interests naturally do. Picture Christopher's wartime service during the Second World War, joining the Royal Engineers and eventually serving overseas, where he saw genuine combat and sustained a head wound serious enough to require his own eventual medical evacuation. Consider what this experience likely meant for a young man who had spent his own childhood as a symbol of gentle, peaceful, entirely uncomplicated innocence, encountering instead the genuine, considerable danger and hardship of actual modern warfare. A stark, sobering contrast between the fictional Christopher Robin readers everywhere still imagined, and the real young man now facing genuine wartime danger on his own family's behalf. Consider how this same wartime experience likely reshaped Christopher's own sense of himself considerably more than anything connected to his childhood fame ever could. Real combat, real injury, real adult responsibility, experiences that belonged entirely to him, unmediated by his father's careful pen or by any reader's own comfortable assumptions about who Christopher Robin was actually supposed to be. It's worth understanding his own eventual, deliberate turn toward Devon and bookselling as following directly from exactly this same hard-won, genuinely adult self-understanding. A man who had, by that point, lived through experiences considerably realer and considerably more difficult than anything his own famous childhood namesake had ever needed to face. Picture a considerably more recent piece of this story's ongoing cultural life. A 2018 film imagining an adult Christopher Robin, now a working man burdened by his own busy post-war career, reconnecting with Pooh and his other childhood companions during a moment of genuine personal crisis. It's worth being clear that this particular film represents an entirely fictionalized, imaginative extension of the original characters, rather than any kind of accurate biographical account of the real Christopher's own actual adult life. Since the real man never worked in quite the corporate setting the film imagines, and never experienced any single dramatic reunion with his own actual childhood toys in quite this cinematic fashion. Consider, though, what this same fictionalized premise still manages to capture honestly, even without being strictly biographical. A genuine, widely resonant idea that adult life can gradually pull people away from exactly the kind of patient, gentle attention childhood naturally offers, and that reconnecting, even briefly, with that same unhurried quality can offer real, considerable comfort to a genuinely overworked adult mind. It's a fitting, if imaginative, tribute to exactly the same basic gift the real Ashdown Forest once offered a real father and his real small son, nearly a century before any film studio ever thought to tell a fictionalized version of their story. Picture the specific texture of an ordinary stuffed toy from this particular era. Mohair fur rather than the softer synthetic materials modern children's toys typically use today. Glass eyes, carefully stitched into place, joints that allowed limited but genuine movement. The whole object considerably heavier and considerably more solidly constructed than most contemporary stuffed animals. Christopher's own bear, handled daily across years of genuine, considerable childhood affection, would have shown real, visible wear by the time his father began writing about him. Exactly the kind of loved, slightly battered condition that made Eeyore's own fictional melancholy feel so genuinely, believably earned. Consider the particular quality of an English country childhood during this specific historical moment, the 1920, a period sitting squarely between two world wars, when a considerable number of families, like the Milnes, maintained exactly this kind of dual existence. A busy, considered London life balanced against quieter, more restorative countryside weekends. This same basic rhythm, common enough among comfortable English families of this particular era, gave Christopher's own childhood a genuinely distinctive shape, neither purely urban nor purely rural, but carefully alternating between both, in a way that likely deepened his own appreciation for exactly how special and restorative his weekends in Sussex actually were. Picture, one more time, the particular sound of an English forest in late summer, wind moving through gorse and heather, birds calling from somewhere within the pine clumps scattered across the higher ground, the occasional distant bleat of sheep grazing the same common land generations of shepherds had used long before the Milne family ever arrived. This is the actual soundscape a small boy would have carried with him through every single one of the stories his father eventually wrote, whether or not any specific sound ever made it explicitly onto the printed page. Picture, gently, everything tonight's careful account has actually tried to hold together at once, since it's worth naming the pattern plainly before we continue much further. A genuine, well-documented true story, verified through biographers, archivists, and the considered testimony of Christopher's own adult writing, sitting alongside decades of gentle popular mythologizing that has, understandably enough, sanded away much of the story's real complexity in favor of something simpler and more comfortably sentimental. Tonight's own version has tried throughout to hold both halves honestly, the genuine warmth and the genuine difficulty, without letting either one fully erase the other. Consider how differently this same story might read if told purely as tragedy. A childhood stolen by fame, a family fractured by literary ambition, or purely as fairy tale, a magical forest, a beloved bear, a golden childhood untouched by any real difficulty at all. Neither version would actually be true. The real story, the one we've spent tonight carefully walking through, sits somewhere genuinely, honestly between those two simpler versions, exactly where most real, complicated human lives actually tend to sit, once you take the time to look closely enough. Picture Christopher's own remarkable achievement in the end, not the fame itself, which he never chose, but the considered, patient life he eventually built despite it, and in some genuine ways because of it. A marriage genuinely his own, a daughter he devoted himself to caring for, a business built on his own actual expertise, a community that came to know him as considerably more than a childhood character. And finally, by every considered account from those who knew him best, a genuine, hard-won piece with the whole complicated shape of his own remarkable life. Picture Leslie's own life continuing on in Devon, following Christopher's death in 1996, maintaining, alongside their shared daughter's ongoing care, the considerable, quiet legacy the two of them had built together across nearly 5 decades of genuine partnership. Consider how fitting it is that this same partnership, built so deliberately apart from anything connected to childhood fame or literary inheritance, remained the true, lasting center of Christopher's own adult life, considerably more significant to him personally than any statue, any translated edition, or any commercial licensing agreement his father's original stories had eventually generated. Picture, too, the considerable community of people who continue actively researching and preserving this entire story even now, decades after Christopher's own death. Archivists at the New York Public Library, carefully maintaining the original toys behind protective glass. Historians in Winnipeg cataloging Harry Colebourn's own preserved wartime diaries. Conservators in Ashdown Forest balancing genuine public access against careful ecological protection, and biographers continuing to research and publish considered accounts of this entire family's real, complicated history. None of tonight's careful account happened by accident. It exists because a great many people across multiple countries and multiple decades decided this particular real story deserved exactly this kind of patient, honest, ongoing attention. Consider, finally, how genuinely rare it actually is for a story this beloved, this thoroughly commercialized and adapted and retold across an entire century, to still have a real, honest, well-documented human story sitting patiently underneath all of that accumulated retelling, waiting for anyone curious enough to look closely enough to actually find it. Tonight, we found it together, slowly, gently, exactly the same unhurried way Christopher himself once wandered through a real Sussex forest with his own real toys, in no particular hurry at all to get anywhere in particular. Picture Winnie's own considerable, full life at the London Zoo, continuing on there for 2 full decades after Harry Colebourn first left her in the zoo's care, remaining a genuine, beloved fixture well into the 1930s, long after most visitors had likely forgotten or never even knew the specific wartime circumstances that had originally brought her there. She died in 1934, having spent by far the greater portion of her own life at the zoo rather than in Canada or on any wartime training ground, meaning the gentle, trusting bear who had so charmed young Christopher Robin during his own childhood visits was, by the time of those particular encounters, already a genuinely well-established, long-settled resident rather than any kind of temporary or recent arrival. Consider what this longer timeline actually adds to the story, since it means Winnie herself had considerable years to develop her own particular reputation for gentleness and tolerance before Christopher ever personally met her. A reputation built patiently across many seasons and many thousands of ordinary visitors, long before one particular small boy's own visit happened to matter more than any of the others. It's worth appreciating how much quiet, accumulated time actually sits behind even the most famous, most celebrated moments in this entire story. Winnie's own 2 decades of gradual, earned trust, Christopher's own years of ordinary nursery play before any book existed, Alan Milne's own considerable earlier writing career before Pooh ever arrived to complicate it. Nothing in this whole remarkable story actually happened quickly. Picture the actual, everyday version of the bear's name Christopher would have genuinely used around the house, since Winnie the Pooh itself, with its careful hyphenation and its 2 separate borrowed names joined together, was always something closer to a formal, complete title than an everyday nickname. In ordinary daily conversation, the bear was almost certainly simply Pooh, the fuller name reserved for more formal introduction, exactly the same way a person might have both a full given name and a considerably shorter, more casual version everyone in the family actually used. Consider how this same small linguistic detail reflects something genuinely true about the entire story we've spent tonight exploring, formal published versions existing alongside considerably more casual, more intimate everyday reality. The careful book title, Winnie the Pooh, sitting alongside the ordinary, everyday Pooh, a small boy actually called his bear while playing with him on any ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Both versions were genuinely real. One was simply written down for the whole world to read, and the other remained, for the most part, privately, quietly Christopher's own. Picture the considerable weight of everything we've gathered together across tonight's careful, patient journey. A midwife arriving early to a Chelsea townhouse, a teddy bear from Harrods, a swan on a rented Sussex pond, a Canadian soldier's spontaneous kindness at a small Ontario train station, a hollow walnut tree, a rebuilt wooden footbridge, 3 separate autobiographical books written decades later by a boy determined to finally tell his own version of events. Each piece, taken entirely on its own, is genuinely small and ordinary. Together, patiently assembled, they add up to one of the most beloved and one of the most honestly complicated real stories behind any piece of children's literature ever written. Consider what actually connects a Canadian veterinarian's $20 impulse purchase to a small boy's own considerable childhood difficulty decades later, to a Devon bookshop, to a daughter's careful lifelong care, to a peaceful death in April of 1996. Perhaps simply this, that ordinary kindness, patiently offered and patiently received, tends to travel considerably further and considerably longer than anyone involved could ever reasonably anticipate at the time, reaching forward across decades and continents in ways that eventually, quietly, help shape a real, complicated, ultimately peaceful human life. Picture, gently, the actual forest one more time, not as fiction, not as beloved literary landmark, but simply as itself, heather and gorse and pine, a quiet stream beneath a small wooden bridge, exactly the kind of ordinary, patient, unhurried place that once gave one particular real family exactly what they most needed: a little peace, a little quiet, and eventually considerably more of both than any of them could have possibly known to hope for at the time. Picture the various personal items connected to this story that have, over the decades since, made their way into museum collections, private collections, and occasional public auction. Original manuscript pages in Alan Milne's own careful handwriting, early editions bearing genuine family inscriptions, correspondence between the various people connected to this real story's actual unfolding. Consider how each of these physical objects represents one more small, tangible thread connecting today's readers directly back to the actual, lived reality behind these beloved stories. Real paper, real ink, real handwriting, considerably more immediate and considerably more moving than any published, printed edition could ever quite manage to be on its own. Picture a research library, reading room somewhere. A scholar carefully examining one of these original documents, wearing the same kind of careful white gloves used to protect fragile historical materials, working to piece together some further small detail about exactly how these stories actually came to be written. This same careful, patient, scholarly work, repeated across decades and across multiple institutions and multiple researchers, is genuinely what has allowed tonight's own account to be told with this much confidence and this much real, documented detail, rather than simply repeating whichever comfortable, simplified legend had already settled into popular imagination long ago. Why does knowing all of this real, sometimes difficult detail actually matter, rather than simply enjoying the gentle books themselves without ever asking what lay behind them? Consider what we genuinely miss without it. The real courage in Christopher's own decision to write honestly about his difficult childhood, rather than simply performing gratitude for a story the whole world already loved. The real tenderness in a soldier's quiet, lifelong devotion to a bear he'd known for only a few brief wartime months. The real, patient work an entire family put into eventually finding their own separate versions of peace. The gentle version of this story is genuinely lovely. The real version, complications and all, is considerably more moving, precisely because it actually happened to actual people who had to actually live through every single part of it themselves. Picture how this same basic principle, that real stories, honestly told, tend to matter more than their comfortable, simplified versions, has run through nearly every single night we've spent together, exploring history's own quieter corners. Christopher Robin Milne's real story joins a long, considerable list of beloved narratives that turn out to be richer and more genuinely worth our patient attention once someone takes the care to tell them exactly as they actually happened, rather than only as we might prefer to remember them. Picture, one more time, the actual sequence of real names threading through this entire story. Edward becoming Winnie the Pooh. A swan lending half its name to a bear who never knew any swans at all. A Canadian town lending its own name to an orphaned cub who never actually set foot there herself. Consider how genuinely playful and unplanned this entire naming chain actually was. No committee, no careful marketing decision, simply a small boy's own delighted, spontaneous creativity, combining whatever names he happened to love most at any given moment into something considerably better than either original name, managed entirely on its own. Picture the considerable irony worth sitting with tonight, that a story now recognized instantly across dozens of countries and dozens of languages began with absolutely no plan or ambition behind it whatsoever. Simply a father's genuine affection for his own small son, and a small son's own genuine affection for a handful of ordinary stuffed toys. Nobody involved in any of these real, original events was trying to create anything lasting or significant. They were simply living their own quiet, ordinary family life in a real Sussex farmhouse on real weekend afternoons, entirely unaware that any of it would eventually matter to anyone beyond their own small, immediate household. Picture Christopher's own daughter, Claire, once more, since her own life deserves one further gentle mention before we finally turn toward home. Despite her considerable physical limitations, those who knew the family well describe Claire as having lived a genuinely engaged, meaningful life within the limits her condition allowed, surrounded by her parents' devoted, patient care for well over 5 decades. Consider how directly this same patient devotion echoes the careful, attentive love Christopher himself had once received from his own father, even amid all that relationships own genuine complexity. A quality of careful attention apparently passed down in its own considerably transformed way from one generation to the next. Picture, too, the Claire Milne Trust, a charitable organization carrying her own name and continuing to support people living with cerebral palsy. A genuinely practical, ongoing legacy, considerably different in character from anything involving bears or forests, but no less rooted in the same fundamental values: patience, devotion, and genuine care for someone who needed it, that ran through this entire family's real story from its very earliest, gentlest beginning. Picture the considerable distance separating a real Ontario train station in 1914 from a real Devon bookshop nearly 40 years later, and consider everything that had to happen in the right order at the right time for these two seemingly unconnected places to eventually belong to the very same continuous, real story. A trapper's difficult choice to spare an orphaned cub rather than kill her too. A soldier's willingness to pay a considerable sum on a whim. A zoo willing to accept an unusual wartime donation. A father with the time and inclination to notice his own son's imaginative play closely enough to write it down. A publisher willing to take a chance on stories about a bear. And eventually, a grown man's own quiet courage write honestly about exactly what all of it had actually cost him. Consider how fragile this entire chain of real events genuinely was, how easily any single link could have broken entirely. A different trapper who simply killed the cub outright, a soldier without Colebourn's own particular fondness for animals, a zoo unwilling to accept an unusual donation, a father too busy or too uninterested to notice his own sons play closely enough to write about it. None of tonight's entire story was ever inevitable. It depended, at every single stage, on ordinary people making ordinary, individually unremarkable choices that happened together to add up to something genuinely remarkable in the end. Picture Christopher's own 3 autobiographical books sitting today on library shelves alongside his father's considerably more famous children's stories. An adult son's own careful, considered voice placed directly beside his father's earlier, equally careful account of the very same shared childhood. Consider how genuinely rare it is for both versions of a family story, the original creative work and the subject's own later, honest response to it, to remain so thoroughly, so accessibly preserved side by side, allowing any curious reader today to actually hear both perspectives, rather than only the more famous, more commercially successful one. Picture a reader today encountering both accounts for the first time, moving from the warm, gentle world of the original Pooh books directly into Christopher's own, considerably more complicated adult reflection on what living inside that same warm, gentle world had actually genuinely felt like from his own side of it. Consider how this same reading experience, done thoughtfully, offers something genuinely valuable, a fuller, considerably more honest understanding of a story most readers have only ever encountered in its gentlest, most simplified form. Let your own breathing settle a little further now, slow and steady, since we're approaching the last stretch of tonight's own careful, patient journey together. Picture everything we've walked through gathered gently into its simplest possible shape. A real boy, a real bear, a real forest, real difficulty honestly acknowledged, and a real, considered peace eventually, genuinely found. Nothing about tonight's account needed any invention or exaggeration to feel worth your attention. It simply needed the patience to be told exactly as it actually happened, one gentle, honest detail at a time. Consider, one more time, the particular quality of care this entire story has always required from everyone who's ever tried to tell it honestly. Milne's own careful attention to his son's ordinary play. Christopher's own considered courage in finally speaking his own truth decades later. Biographers and archivists patiently assembling the real documented record. And tonight, your own quiet, patient attention, listening all the way through a story considerably more complicated and considerably more genuinely moving than its gentlest popular version ever quite managed to convey. Picture the specific moment tonight's own story actually began. Roughly a century ago now. A midwife waiting in an upstairs room, a couple expecting a daughter, and welcoming a son instead, choosing together two separate names for a boy who had no possible way of knowing what either name would eventually come to mean to the rest of the entire world. Consider how ordinary that specific moment actually was, indistinguishable at the time from countless other ordinary births happening across London that same August day. Nothing about it suggesting, even slightly, the remarkable, complicated, ultimately peaceful story that particular small life would eventually contain. Picture, too, everything that same ordinary beginning eventually grew into. A real forest walked patiently by a real father and son. A real bear named for a real Canadian soldier's real kindness. Real books loved by real children across an entire world and an entire century. Real difficulty honestly faced, and real peace eventually, genuinely found. It's worth carrying that entire arc gently into your own sleep tonight, that even the most ordinary beginning can grow, given enough time and enough patient, genuine attention, into something considerably larger and considerably more worth remembering than anyone standing in that original Chelsea bedroom could have possibly imagined. Picture the considerable number of real people whose own separate lives had to intersect in exactly the right way at exactly the right time for this entire story to unfold the way it actually did. Bessie Bashford arriving a month early to attend a birth. Harry Colebourn choosing kindness over indifference at a small train platform. A trapper willing to sell rather than simply keep his unexpected catch. A zoo willing to accept an unusual donation. An illustrator carrying his own private grief into careful, tender line work. A biographer decades later willing to spend years researching a story already thought thoroughly told. Each one of these real people contributed something genuinely essential, without any single one of them fully understanding, at the time, exactly what they were actually building together. Consider, finally, how comforting it might be to recognize that your own ordinary life, right now, tonight, likely contains its own small collection of similarly unremarkable, ordinary moments, any one of which might, in ways you can't yet possibly predict, eventually matter considerably more than it currently seems to. Christopher Robin Milne's own story began with nothing more dramatic than a couple choosing two names for an unexpected son. Sometimes that's genuinely all any remarkable story ever actually needs to begin with: an ordinary moment, patiently, gently allowed to unfold into whatever it eventually, quietly becomes. Picture one final time before we turn fully toward home, the actual physical journey these real objects and real places have taken across the past century. A bear crossing an ocean from Canada. A boy's toys eventually crossing another ocean to New York. A family's country house passing through private hands long after the Milnes themselves moved on. A forest remaining patiently exactly where it has always been, waiting for anyone curious enough to still come walking through it. Consider how much distance, literal and otherwise, this entire story has actually traveled, from a Canadian trapper's roadside sale to a research library's careful glass display case, from one small boy's private nursery play to a translated bestseller read in dozens of languages across the entire world. Consider, too, that despite all this considerable distance and considerable transformation, the actual heart of the story never really changed at all. Ordinary kindness, ordinary love, ordinary attention, patiently offered and patiently received across every single stage of its own remarkable, century-long journey. Picture the particular kind of quiet satisfaction available in finally knowing a beloved story's real, complete history, not simply the comfortable, gentle version most of us grew up with, but the genuine, honestly complicated truth underneath it. Consider how this same satisfaction has run through every single one of our nights together, exploring history's own quieter corners, the real story almost always turning out richer, more genuinely human, and more genuinely worth our patient attention than whichever simplified version had already settled comfortably into popular memory. Picture Christopher himself, somewhere in his own considered later years, perhaps sitting quietly in his own Devon home, having finally, patiently made peace with the entire remarkable shape of his own life, the golden childhood and its genuine difficulty, the fame he never chose and the identity he eventually built entirely on his own terms. The forest he'd once wandered as a small boy, and the considerably different, considerably fuller man that same boy eventually gently became. Picture the very last image tonight's story actually needs. Not a grand statue, not a best-selling translation, not a courtroom or a licensing agreement, but something considerably smaller and considerably truer. A father and his young son walking together through real Sussex heather on an ordinary weekend afternoon. A stuffed bear tucked under one small arm. No plan at all beyond simply enjoying the walk itself, entirely unaware that anyone beyond the two of them would ever come to care about where their feet happened to be taking them that particular day. Consider that same walk continuing in a real sense right up through tonight, since the actual forest is still there, the actual bridge still stands, and somewhere, right now, another parent and another small child are very likely walking that exact same stretch of Ashdown Forest, entirely unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, that they're following the same quiet path a real father and his real son once wandered together nearly 100 years before either one of them was ever born. Picture the specific comfort available in knowing this, that ordinary places, ordinary walks, ordinary afternoons spent with someone you love carry their own genuine, lasting worth entirely apart from whether anyone ever writes them down or turns them into anything the wider world eventually comes to know and love. Christopher Robin's own particular walk happened to become famous. Most ordinary walks never do. And that was never actually the point of any of them in the first place. Consider, too, everything real and true still waiting quietly in your own memory tonight, your own version of a real forest, a real companion, a real, unhurried afternoon that mattered considerably more to you than it likely ever mattered to anyone else. Tonight's story was never really only about one specific famous boy and his specific famous bear. It was about the genuine, universal value of exactly this kind of patient, ordinary attention, wherever and whenever it happens to occur. Picture the entire arc of tonight's own long, careful journey compressed now into its simplest possible shape. A birth, a bear, a swan, a forest, a difficult adolescence honestly acknowledged, a marriage genuinely chosen, a shop genuinely built, a daughter genuinely loved, and at the very end of it all, a peaceful sleep in a quiet Devon town, a man finally, genuinely at rest with the whole complicated shape of his own remarkable life. Picture, gently, the last bit of daylight fading now over that same real Sussex forest, heather and gorse, settling into evening shadow, the small wooden bridge quiet, the old hollow walnut tree standing exactly where it's always stood, patient and unhurried, the way real places and real memories tend to be. Picture one last researcher, somewhere tonight, in an archive or a library or a quiet study, still carefully working through some small remaining detail of this same real story. A letter not yet fully catalogued, a photograph not yet properly dated, a small piece of the actual historical record still waiting patiently for someone curious enough to notice it properly. This particular story, like every genuinely well-documented real history, isn't actually finished being told. It simply pauses here tonight, gently, for now, exactly the way Christopher's own real story eventually did, not with any dramatic final flourish, but with a quiet, considered peace, patiently, honestly earned. Picture, finally, the actual bear himself, resting quietly behind protective glass at a research library, thousands of miles from the Sussex nursery where he began, considerably more traveled than his original owner could have ever anticipated. Still, after everything, simply an ordinary teddy bear, loved once by an ordinary small boy in an ordinary, real English home. Consider that same ordinary bear and everything his own extraordinary journey has actually taught us tonight, that the smallest, gentlest, most ordinary things, offered and received with genuine care, are very often exactly the things that end up mattering most to the people who lived them, and eventually to everyone who comes to hear the real story afterward. Picture that same stretch of forest one final time, Ashdown, still standing in East Sussex tonight, exactly as it stood a century ago, heather and gorse and silver birch, a hilltop clump of pines still catching whatever light happens to be left in the sky. Somewhere down near the old farmhouse, a small wooden footbridge still crosses a quiet stream, rebuilt first in 1979 to match the book's own illustrations, closely enough that Christopher Robin Milne himself came back to reopen it, and rebuilt again 2 decades later after further wear. Children still play the same simple game there today, dropping sticks on one side and watching for them on the other, exactly the way a father and his small son once did, with no idea at all that the game itself would eventually outlive them, both by considerably more than 100 years. We began this story with a swan on a pond and a bear in a toy shop. And we're ending it with a bookshop in Devon, a daughter who needed real, devoted care, and a man who spent the second half of his life quietly, patiently becoming entirely his own person, separate from the small, golden-haired boy his father's stories had made famous before he was old enough to have any say in the matter. Both halves of that story are true. Neither one cancels the other out. If your mind is still resting somewhere back in that forest, among the toys and the walnut tree and the small wooden bridge, that's all right. There's nothing left to hold onto tonight, nothing you need to remember for later. Let your jaw loosen one more time. Let your shoulders sink further into whatever is holding you up, mattress or couch or chair, wherever tonight happens to have found you. Take one more slow breath in and let it go even more slowly than the last, the way a small boy's afternoon in the forest always eventually had to end, gently, with his father's hand finding his own, and the two of them turning quietly back toward home. Christopher Robin Milne died in his sleep in April of 1996, in the small Devon town where he'd spent so many quiet, considered years building a life genuinely his own. Those who knew him well in his final years say he had, by then, made real and lasting peace with the whole complicated shape of his own remarkable story. It's a gentle thing to carry with you into your own sleep tonight, that even a childhood this extraordinary, this thoroughly shared with the entire world before he'd ever had the chance to claim it for himself, could still, eventually, quietly, become something he was simply, finally glad to have lived. Sleep well.